All right, folks, welcome back to MEA 425, Media Copyright and Licensing. Um, this is a short presentation that looks at um, the fact that, technology and creativity and on one side and business practice and, sort of legal regulation on the other side are not always in step, certainly. And music licensing sort of is trying to occupy the space in between. And so sometimes it's able to um, successfully negotiate those changing areas, and sometimes it's not. Um, and so that's why you have um, good license writing for, if you're drafting a synchronization license in particular, does not is not bound to look just at the situation as it stands today, but should be reflecting about um, how you want to position your work, your intellectual property, as time moves forward. Do you want it to be able to go into different, perhaps unknown technology avenues, or do you want it to be, confined to the one that you're writing it for, and then people have to come and request more licenses? There are pros and cons to both of those situations. Okay, so overview for this. So we want to look at some of the what's meant by old licenses and new uses outside of the little introduction I just gave. Um, Look in particular at how media technology moves very quickly, and what sort of impacts that has on the terms that lawyers choose when they draft licenses for intellectual property like music and recordings. Um, as synchronization licensing came into use, in particular, in the latter half of the 20th century, what terms have been specific to um, aid or to limit that growth. And then three types of language that licenses can use. So to aid in the growth would be, um, for the inclusion of music and future technologies. To limit would be, language that is against the inclusion of the protected music in future technologies. And then we've got this instances where licenses are drafted that have ambiguous language. And so how have those been dealt with? And then I'll leave you with a few tips on how to draft licenses so that they are well positioned to as time goes forward. Okay, so the central question, to return to the introduction, as technology continues to evolve, how do we read the permissions or understand or apply permissions that are granted in older licenses? So, for example, in the 1980s, license writers for movies that were produced at that time, updated the wording of their licenses to include the term videograms, right? And so videograms would be um, a any recording that is outside of the the film itself, but is exemplified by like a VHS or a DVD, that can be taken from machine to machine on the consumer level and sort of plugged in and seen. And so it's a tangible physical copy of the original film. And so there you have an explosion of home theater viewing at that time, and so it makes a lot of sense to capitalize on that and to include that language in the licenses for those movies that were made at that time. However, that raises the question: what do you do with the licenses from older films that were published before the VHS and DVD eras. And so some of them, those licenses specified this is for theatrical use, so meaning a public cinema, right? You go into the movie theater and see it, so it's performance. And so by being very specific, they ended up excluding, right, future use or inclusion in this sort of any new technology outside of that, whether it was, downloading, streaming, videograms, or other. And so other licenses were vague or they even were completely open to future media types. So there's a lot of ways that licenses can position themselves in this situation where you've got technology and that's out of step with, in this case, the practice of drafting licenses. So, to look at some of the language by era here, so the synchronization in the 1920s, so once again, a sync license is going to allow a music user, in this case, like a film production, TV studio, for example, to use composition. So Circle C in their narrative and their storytelling that's embodied in the television show or film. And so in the 20s, you've got the right to reproduce a song that's in association with whatever motion pictures, put X there. In the 30s, you've got the advent of sound that's actually being combined with, I think, 1929. You've got the jazz singer as the first one. So the language changes there to have, to record and reproduce. So it's not just to reproduce the song, which in the 20s would have been sort of to reproduce as to for the orchestra musicians to play along, or a piano. In some of the theaters, you may have different kinds of instruments for the silent movie. And so in the 1930s, we're getting to a situation where there's a recording that's being attached to the actual film itself. And so that recording remains the same. It doesn't change every time you go to a new theater and you've got different musicians, playing along with the film. In the 1950s to the 1970s, language was expanded to include performance as a new sort of term there, because of the fact that, of the explosion of TV in particular during that time frame, and movies going from cinema over to television, and television being a performance-based broadcast, that you've got, the performing rights organizations are sort of implicated there, whereas in cinema, the performance right is handled separately. This is, once again, a new sort of language that is reflecting the times. And it's interesting to note that, as this period wears on, those licenses were subsequently adjusted to limit the scope of television reproduction. So that, if you had television reproduction, the scope was limited to just the US, but Europe wanted the rights, the TV rights, then that's a new license and more income that comes. And so that gets back to this old adage that the more you limit a license for a property that's in demand, right? That's very important. The more you limit the license for a property that's in demand, the higher the potential income becomes, because if you limit it by time and a year goes by, and it's still in demand, then the users have to come back around and get a new license. It doesn't always work so well with a property that's not in demand. You don't want to have, increase the difficulty of accessing property that people don't know about. And so, as we mentioned a minute ago, in the 1980s, you get the videogram language that's inserted into licenses to make sure that these avenues are represented. In the 1990s, downloading, new language in the licenses to represent downloading, on down the line into streaming. And so it's important to recognize, that these issues of technology do have to be translated and represented on the level of, what I call legalese or lawyer talk, right? And so it's good as a student of this to see what words were chosen and how they sort of get back not only to the bundle of rights, but they tether those rights to certain kinds of technology. Um, and it helps you understand, how these properties are understood, how the exploitation of these properties are understood from a, more of a management or business sort of perspective. Um, a few licensing tips here. Language impacts the viability and profitability of works through time, right? So if you, for example, use terms like, works reproduced by means now or hereafter known, that's a simple turn of phrase there that basically means that whether we have the technology to play it now or there are new technologies that come into the marketplace that people are using that would be hereafter, right? Later on, known technologies come in. So not now known, but known later, just to be clear. Then that means that work is being positioned for, maximum exploitation over time, no matter what kinds of different types of media there are. However, on the other hand, works whose reproduction is specified to certain types of technology will limit future use. And so some of those early cases, court cases on, how do we apply this existing license to television if it was written for in the film only era. If the license specifies that this is for, keeps returning to the idea this is for public cinema use, then the analysis is that it's not required for, or it's not set up for television or some other kind of use. And so it's a kind of a fine balance there. On the one hand, general licenses should allow what the user needs, like exactly what the user needs. However, limitation, and this gets back to the point I was making a second ago, limitation can lead to more money if it's a better known property and the users are coming back and willing to pay for these different kinds of access. However, limitation can also lead to less money because if you've got a lesser known work, then it's too much hassle, right? You're putting the bar to access higher and higher by making people come back to do extra work to get access to a property that isn't actually that well known. And so those are some important things to think about. Of course, you don't always know how things are going to go in the future. And so I think that going back to the general rule of licenses should allow exactly what the user needs is going to be probably the best advice. But I'll leave that to you to decide. Put in some comments to discuss that in the section below. Thank you.